Well, recent political changes from Zimbabwe to Angola and right here in South Africa at home have sparked renewed optimism about investment in the continent. Will Africa be able to ride the wave of new technologies offered by the thinking around the fourth industrial revolution in order to rise again? Do we even need those technologies? Is it even about the technologies? I'm Bruce Whitfield. This is Taking Stock on ENCA, and I'm joined by the knowledge lead from the World Economic Forum's Fourth Industrial Revolution practice, Anne-Marie Larsen, and the political economist Sia Beniza. Sia, let's start with you. Broad continental overview. The consultants will tell us Africa presents the greatest opportunity in the last 50 years for companies around the world to capitalize on a demographic revolution of only the most positive and fruitful kind. That's one side of that particular coin. By 2030, we could have 1.4 billion people living on our continent and nobody in a better economic position than they are now. Those are two sides of exactly the same coin, surely.
Yes, I think that's really the challenge of, as well as that opposes the opportunity that Africa is facing. I think with a lot of investment that is taking place and that still needs to take place. I mean, the African Development Bank is trying to source around 111 trillion for infrastructure investment on the continent, and that's a real big opportunity for people involved in construction, etc. But I think we cannot really take advantage of the demographic dividend without creating opportunities for jobs, without even creating opportunities for entrepreneurship, which I think is more important than just creating jobs. So on the one hand, Africa does create opportunities, but the current socioeconomic and political conditions are easing, but the economic and socioeconomic conditions are still a major constraints. Incomes are very low, literacy rates are very low. A lot of the opportunity is then constrained as a result of this.
And we've seen technology coming to the fore quite nicely in many spheres, but on quite an elementary basis. The use in Kenya, for example, where the banking system isn't as evolved in South Africa, of mobile phones to transfer money was a great example. And people have put a huge amount of optimism on that one fact, that you see technology really enables better lives in Africa. And it does, but not perhaps in the way that the fairy tale books are telling us the fourth industrial revolution is going to do all the horrible jobs and we're all going to have more time to sit on the beach in future.
Look, I think for me this speaks to the way that Africa is integrated generally, in the international economy as well as global production networks generally. I think in as much as the world can pat itself on its back in terms of technological advancements and smartphones, etc., the things that are at the frontier aren't typically done or made for, African consumers. Whether you look at some of the top-end smartphones, which inevitably result in some conflict on the continent as a result of extraction of minerals in places like the DRC, etc. And so it seems as though despite all the innovation and technological advancement, the way in which Africa has been integrated and considered in this is typically neglected, and so we don't innovate for African consumers or the African, generally producers. And I think there was a try with, Southeast Asian movement around this, creating for the bottom of the pyramid. But I think in many cases it was very demeaning how it was done, and the technologies, weren't of high quality, as though, people who are poorer don't value quality. And so that has fizzled out. But I think, things that are at the frontier driving the fourth industrial revolution aren't integrating Africa because the innovators and the production networks don't take Africa into consideration.
Great point to bring you here, Anne-Marie. You work for the World Economic Forum. You're based in Geneva. And the World Economic Forum has been really big on the fourth industrial revolution. It was the theme of the Davos gathering 2016, I think it was. And absolutely central to this thinking around the fourth industrial revolution. It's almost as if this is the silver bullet to solve the world's problems.
It is definitely not the silver bullet to solve the world's problems. I think looking at the African continent, we see that industrial revolutions have been excluding more and more people. We still have 25% only that are able to use the internet. That's a prerequisite for even being part of the third industrial revolution. Half of the continent do not have access to electricity. That is a technology of the second industrial revolution. And I think it's up to 600 million smallholder farmers who still even haven't mechanized. This is the first industrial revolution. So the fourth industrial revolution in and of itself is not going to create change. Technologies in and of themselves are not going to create change. Political systems need to change. Politicians need to be far more courageous and bold. This is about socioeconomic change as well, and it's about taking that 3.5% growth that the continent is seeing now away from resource extraction and primary industries towards inclusive, sustainable growth that is also creating jobs, because the challenges and the concerns that we see a lot in the West about automation from robotics and AI are also going to be a huge challenge on the African continent.
And it's so refreshing to hear, because disciples of the Fourth Industrial Revolution movement will have you believe that the device that is in your pocket, this is going to solve the world's problems. It may address some of them. It may facilitate better transactions. It may enable people to communicate. And maybe one day there will be a surgeon in a remote area who will do life-saving heart surgery on a child that could never be done before. But that's not what is going to change the fundamental structure of economies across this continent.
Look, the drones example, I think, is an amazing technology that we're seeing being used in a very novel way in Rwanda, where drones are delivering blood. It is a whole new way of thinking about airspace and about basic service delivery. But it does not take away the need for a hospital every 100 kilometers. It does not take away the need for being able to transport people from A to B in ambulances. So I think we should not look at the technologies as a panacea. These are an opportunities, but that need requires businesses, it requires international investors, it requires governments, civil society leaders to come together and integrate them into a totally different way. I think also when we look at the African manufacturing sector, for the past decades, Africa has been deindustrializing. Being able to integrate emerging technologies require you to have a manufacturing base. We're not going to see people that can create huge businesses solely based on access to 3D printing. That requires a manufacturing path dependency, and it requires a trajectory of production. So I think we still need to look at some of those more classical pathways to development, while we're also looking at how can technology then become part of that, and how can that maybe speed up some of those processes. But at the same time, we also see a world around Africa where technologies are impacting at a scale and a scope and a pace that is unprecedented, disrupting industries that used to be part of a global value chain that Africa could speak into. Part of those value chains are completely being disruptive, and that's going to be a challenge as well.
That actually creates more problems than solutions for the African continent. Yeah?
Yes, I think. But I think we are commendable in what we've been able to achieve, I think, because everywhere else you look, and I think the greatest achievement has been around the regional integration process. Whereas everywhere else you look, people get the economic basis for regional integration. Europe, for example, Southeast Asia, etc. But the biggest hurdle is the political will. And I think African leaders have shown that there's a political will, despite the limited economic base, for us to, to drive the integration process. And I think if Africa is able to disrupt these value chains, as we've seen with the finance sector and how M-Pesa has disrupted, the finance sector throughout, and how people are looking at how to resolve issues of financial inclusion, etc. I think Africa is able to innovate, but the innovations then need to be grounded in our capacity and improving the capacity to produce, rather than relying on raw mineral exports. But I think the current political economic structures on the continent are maintained by people who have a deep interest in them being so. Cheaper minerals, etc., inputs to existing industrial capacity. And so this, fourth industrial revolution, and the way in which, as you mentioned, there's some African farmers who are still trying to get over the first industrial revolution of mechanizing agriculture, for example. It is also an indictment on people who have reached the fourth industrial revolution, leaving behind the continent. And it is about, what are you innovating for? And similarly, and the global inequality discussion is again, an indictment upon people who are right at the frontier of technological advancement, economic advancement, etc. And what is the purpose and the goal of the innovation? It cannot be, good in and of itself, as you say.
How much innovation is enough, and how much is too much, and how much actually causes greater dislocation than we have even right now? More with Anne-Marie Engtoft-Larsen and Sia Beniza after this break, taking stock on ENCA. Well, world lenders and development bodies have revised growth expectations for some of Africa's major economies. This with commodity prices going up. Oil this week, $78 a barrel. Great if you're Angolan or Nigerian, but it doesn't solve the problem of the structures of these economies. Nigeria, for example, without any of its own oil refining capacity. Until it has that, can it be truly competitive? I'm taking stock on Africa's ability to rise again with Anne-Marie Engtoft-Larsen from the World Economic Forum and Sia Beniza from Political Economy South southern Africa. So we've got this world which is, rather than sort of everybody being included in this fourth industrial revolution and everyone getting on the train and going in the same direction, you've got a developed world which is tearing ahead and leaving large parts of the world, some of their own societies, way, way behind. It's actually accentuating divisions rather than what people initially thought with the fourth industrial revolution, bringing people together.
Unless we do something else, yes, that might well be the case. We're seeing the fractures in societies, both in Western countries and in the global South. Those fractures are becoming bigger and bigger. We're seeing inequality at a rise and coming to a level now where we're also seeing the social aspects of it, the social negative aspects of it. So I think the most important task for any politician and for any business leaders engaged is to figure out how do we take a path that is more focused on equality and justice, fairness, and access. How do we do inclusive growth, as we call it at the World Economic Forum, which is to say economic growth is important, but it has to have a social human face.
What that takes is real work. It's much easier, is it not, Sia, to pay lip service, oh, the fourth industrial revolution, technology is going to solve everything. What Anne-Marie's talking about is real policy, real decisions, and real implementation by real breathing, bleeding human beings.
Yeah, and I think, the problem is that with technologies, there's always an unintended consequence. Smartphones, for example. Great technology keeps you connected. You can get your emails on your phone, etc. A bunch of devices that you used to use in the past are now, in the palm of your hand. But then people use them while driving, create all kinds of social havoc. And I think this is part of the side of the consequences of technology that people generally don't think of, because for most people, political problems or socioeconomic problems are either challenging or, not very interesting. It's much more cooler to say, hey, look, we've gotten to this level of advancement scientifically and otherwise, but, the socioeconomic status that we live in, the inequality that's, developing and the disruption that comes from the technologies itself, we're not able to deal with. For example, they've got 3D printers now, which are creatively disrupting the value chain of production. I mean, in the past, you would normally buy your goods from a retailer who orders from a factory, etc., and that already has been disrupted through global and regional value chains that are, spread out throughout the world. But we never really find a way to deal with the unintended consequences of these advancements. And I think it needs, for people who are at the innovation edge, they need to also be considering the consequences of some of the advancements that they're pushing.
If we leave 3/4 of the world behind, or maybe more than that, Anne-Marie, I mean, I don't know what your World Economic Forum statistics tell you, but there's a very real risk of a large proportion of the world being left behind, which creates huge problems for those that think they're ahead.
Huge conflicts. I mean, this is not a task only for African leaders. This is a global task. Shaping the fourth industrial revolution so that it is human-centered, inclusive, and create better lives for the many and not for the few. Create hopes and optimism about a better future for your children. That is, I think, a global task.
But are we going in a direction that is not... we talk about that's what it should do, but in reality, human nature is such that those who have access to the assets that will make them richer and more powerful simply retain it rather than share it.
I see a bottom-up movement that really encourages me and that makes me optimistic on many behalves. Yesterday, I was together with about 20 young entrepreneurs from various African countries, showcasing how they are taking technology, and not just to play what we would call a silly game on the smartphone, but using technologies to increase the livelihoods of smallholder farmers, to have better health access, using these technologies to create growth, jobs, prosperity. Those entrepreneurs make me optimistic on behalf of the world. The thing is, I think our political leadership, organizations like my own, we need to listen to those young voices and learn from what enabling environment they are creating around innovation. And then we need to understand that we cannot just take technologies from foreign technologies and just adopt them without thinking about what ethical frameworks were they developed in, what are the biases and assumptions, how are these empowering African customers, African citizens. And I think this has to be at the forefront as well.
But here's the point, yeah. Nobody really cares except people in Africa who, frankly, many people are simply struggling to survive on a daily basis and don't have time to apply their minds to what is going to be required out of this fourth industrial revolution. So who's going to lead it? from our perspective as Africans?
Yeah, look, I think in as much as there are these challenges and problems that come with technological advancement and innovation, etc., it does present a new world. And I think what our leaders and everybody needs to understand is, just like the economy is developing, you know, like we're moving away from where things were produced in one country, they're now produced all over the globe. You get parts from different places and they're assembled elsewhere, etc. The same is going to apply to the way in which people develop. And we're already starting to see this, the rising importance of cities, for example, which in many cases overshadows the national state. So what is happening is there's some sort of decentralization of both power as a result of economic and technological advancements, which is enabling people to be self-empowered. And I think there's also an ethic that's coming with it that wasn't there before, you know, with the, you know, advancements of capitalism under colonialism, etc. But I think it's much more of a diffuse thing. It's no longer just going to be led by, you know, African strongmen or, you know, the US or Europe, etc. It's becoming a much more diffused world that's led by sort of unifying human ethic in a way, if you might call it, but also enabling people to take ownership of themselves in various ways. That's what a lot of the technological advancements are doing. And I think the indictment on the people at the frontier, you know, as to who are you innovating for, is an indictment that says we should be innovating, you know, towards things that enable and enhance people's individual power, that enhance people's ability to sort of seek out for themselves, rather than, you know, the world of the past where you did wait for a government or you did wait for, you know, a job that's going to sort you out. Now people are realizing actually the economy is becoming diffused. We need to informalize, and everybody is taking on that role individually.
Many people get very excited by that idea. Many more of you may be absolutely petrified by that idea. We know how the world works, or has worked up until now, and if it's worked for you, that's been great. For far too many, however, the world has not worked and won't work in the future unless we harness these technologies better. More in a moment. Well, this week saw Africa's biggest telecommunications network, MTN, join forces with Chinese equipment maker Huawei to test the 5th generation network, 5G. Could these be signs that Africa is embracing new technologies, and how does it improve your life? This idea of 5G, I barely get a 4G signal anywhere I go at the moment. Now we're talking about 5G. It's terribly exciting. For most people, it means absolutely nothing other than more expensive, faster, hopefully, and more plentiful data into the future. Does that go anywhere to solve the problems we've been talking about for the last 15 minutes?
It definitely does. Like, the broadband is one of the biggest challenges, and I think it's a task that a lot of African leaders are taking very seriously. Until recently, 1 gigabyte cost about the equivalent of 18% of an annual salary for median income in Africa. It is completely unsustainable if we are to roll out the 4th industrial revolution. Actually, a few days ago, the World Economic Forum signed a contract with Smart Africa, so a coalition of 25 countries on the continent, to roll out our Internet for All project, which is really working very closely with business and governments in addressing the issues about broadband. And I think that courageous approach to say we need to work together, no country alone can do this, has to be the approach on a number of issues. So about keeping the ownership, whether it's about new technologies, new innovations, new research, is simply not going to fly in this world. It has to be far more collaborative, and it has to be far more shareable.
No, but that's the point. And we've had lots of talks recently about taking down some borders and getting trade flowing, and perhaps at some point in the future there's talk of a single currency, sub-Saharan Africa, all of that sort of stuff. We're happy to cooperate in the digital world because we don't see it as very real, Sia. Yeah. But on the ground, every single day, countries don't trust each other. Neighbours don't trust each other. Big criticism of South Africans not trusting other Africans. I mean, how do we ever hope to get ahead if we can't do the human basics?
Look, I think sometimes we do tend to get caught up on the negatives, right? And the negatives are really what everybody clearly can see, and is obvious. But the good stories and the individual stories aren't always published. I think there is a lot of progress that African states have made towards the regional integration process. Whether you look at the most recently signed Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, or the signing of the Single Africa tourism market, etc. And there is an existing partnership with South African neighboring countries, a common monetary area, etc., which enables trade and investment across borders in the same currency. But a lot of these things take time. What I'm telling you about SACU and the Rand Common Monetary Area has been established since 1910. It's the oldest customs union. So these things take a lot of time. But I think what our African leaders have shown is the willingness, the political will. And I think in most cases, what we've seen globally, if you look at, the US or Europe, the central problem of the regional integration process there is the political problem. The fact that political leaders change, etc. And, the last leader might have had an idea of a unified North African free trade area, North America free trade area, but the current leader says no, we're neglecting it, building a wall, etc. But I think in as much as the world is disintegrating and pointing at each other and trade wars, etc., the African continent is following suit, obviously led by the East Asian example, towards integration. And I think our leaders now need to back that up with an economic base to back up the political will.
I mean, it's almost as if Africa is counter-cyclical. The world, sort of post-World War II, the social democratic compact is falling apart in many parts of the world, and America is becoming more isolationist, Britain breaking away from the European Union, the Europeans not wanting to give Britain a cushy deal, and the European Union itself incredibly fragile and possibly disintegrating into the future. And here in Africa, people are talking about collaboration and working together again. It's a really interesting place we find ourselves in at the stage of a fourth industrial revolution, Emery.
Very much. And I think there's a lot for other leaders outside Africa to learn of this integration. I will, however, say we're seeing a lot of new political winds of change on the continent. The most important is that they deliver to promises to their citizens. Just changing out the person, it requires much more. Yeah. And I think those political systems, we have seen it in Europe and in North America, just changing the person with a stronger rhetoric doesn't change people's inertia towards these changes, doesn't change the feeling of being left behind and not being part of this grand vision. So I think it requires leaders that are bold and courageous to also change the path, change the trajectory, have a political vision about what type of society would we like to have. Why is it that we're integrating technologies? Because some of these technologies might not make us more happy or more wealthy or more sustainable. So we need to have political visions that is across civil society, citizens, voters, and businesses.
And that's a great long-term view. See, do we have the time? There's so many ticking time bombs all over the world, and on this continent, probably the biggest time bomb is the one of expectation and failed expectations and expectations not be met that possibly weren't realistic or perhaps not properly executed over certainly in South Africa in the last 2.5 decades. So we've got a crisis of expectation which is fueled by access to the world through the fourth industrial revolution. There is a clash coming.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of pressure, and a lot of people would say the so-called African demographic dividend is actually a demographic disaster waiting to happen. Yes, it is without jobs. Yes, it is without promoting entrepreneurship and enabling people to create businesses for themselves. But do we have the time? Definitely not. I think policymakers need to rearrange and look at the world the way it is. I think policymakers are far too caught up in the old world of nationalism, etc. We're coming into an integrated world now. We're coming into a world of global and regional value chains. And that creates, it requires a totally different type of thinking. And that's why people laugh in the face of people, like leaders like in the US, where you want to stage a trade war with, China, the biggest producer globally. It doesn't make sense. You're living in an old world. It's a different world now.
Emery, can we skip the first, second, and third industrial revolutions, please, and simply implement the fourth on this continent? Or is it
not entirely? No. It will take massive investment in infrastructure, education, innovation, entrepreneurship, basic access to technologies, to electricity. That cannot be skipped. Absolutely not. So we are tasking African leaders with something that no one else has ever done, which is to catch up on 4 industrial revolutions. But there is no alternative. And so I think we're already seeing, and I am optimistic on some accounts as well, because I do see pockets where we see things being done quite differently. M-Pesa's massive success really came from a lack of saying, the central bank in Kenya said, we're not going to regulate. This is actually, we're going to give you a framework to disrupt, but then we're going to have oversight and we're going to also manage the risk around it. That approach to new type of governance, being far more agile, not looking at all the input, but looking at the broader impact, if that can take take hold on a more continental basis. I think we say the same with drones in Rwanda, and there are a number of other examples. Those are courageous ways of new types of governance that I think can lead us somewhere.
And we must leave it there. It's the TINA principle. There is no alternative. That is it for this week. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you to our guests and for you at home for participating in tonight's discussion. You can talk to us via Twitter, the handle @ENCA, or @BruceBusiness, directly to me using the hashtag ENCA Taking Stock. You can also catch our latest episodes by subscribing to the ENCA YouTube channel. Do that. Till next time. Bye-bye.